Hi everybody, so we're right around 2 o'clock, so let's get started with today's webinar. Today's webinar is entitled The Anatomy of an Insider Attack, Exploiting Encrypted Networks, and my name is Jason Thompson. I'm the Director of Global Marketing for SSH Communications Security. And I'm here today with Joe Scaff. He's our Director of Global Customer Services at SSH Communications Security. Welcome, Joe, to the webinar series here.
Thank you, Jason. It's good to be here.
Good, so Joe's a special guest here today. Sort of last minute, Joe's back in town. He is actually oftentimes out on the road. He is in charge of right now one of the largest, actually the largest SSH Identity Access Management project, a key management project in the world. It's an ongoing project that's going quite well. And other than just presenting the slide deck here today with a couple of the things that we'll show you from his experience, and we'll add to it his experience in working with some of the Fortune 500 customers and being out in the field actually hands-on. So that's a special last-minute addition that I'm happy to say we can provide for you to hear today. So let's go into what we'll cover here in today's webinar. While we can't possibly show all possible attack vectors, we can talk about current high-risk scenarios impacting most enterprises. And to that end, we will cover how a lack of identity access management controls and encrypted networks enable successful insider attacks. And also threat vectors executing an insider attack using encrypted networks. We'll show you an example of, or several examples of threat vectors that we've discovered that live inside of these organizations. And in fact, we'll show you a couple cases, real-world cases, where an insider has successfully exploited the environment either through SSH keys or some other similar key methodology. We're not always 100% sure and given clear details on the type of breach, but we know that it does happen. We can show you very clearly how this could possibly happen inside of your enterprise as well. And then we'll follow that up with a real-world case study of one of our customers who helped launch the key management project in service. And also we'll follow that up with, of course, now that we've laid out the issues and that there is an actual issue out there, it's a real-world issue. We'll show you how SSH's information assurance platform can help prevent or mitigate the impacts of a malicious insider attack. So let's look first very high level. In the identity access market address capabilities, if we look back when the internet first became very popular, late 90s, mid 90s, one of the first challenges, if you start from the top right-hand side, was external interactive users or customers. And to solve some of those problems, we implemented things like SSL for online login. And of course, over time, we came to know two-factor authentication, such as getting your a passcode, one-time passcode sent to you when you log into your bank account. As identity access management market has moved, it's moved towards more internal and automated processes, including covering employees such as and contractors. And for this, there's solutions out there such as the traditional IAM solutions such as SailPoint and Avexa's. You've got two-factor authentications, security solutions that are out there, either through something like Secure ID from RSA or password as a token type solutions. In fact, we offer a password as a token solution. We won't cover that today, but we also have one as well. And there's also privileged account management tools such as CyberArk and Centrify. And there's also business partner processes in here as well. So with their business partner processes, encryption and security is something that's often enforced by compliance requirements. Sometimes you use similar vendors, but oftentimes compliance ends up being a major driver and tool with that. And from a machine-to-machine standpoint, this is where things are somewhat lacking. While we've gotten a little bit better at the automated processes with our business process partners such as PCI payment processors and folks like that, what we haven't gotten really good at in the market is to address machine-to-machine transactions as well as other SSH monitoring capabilities that are necessary in order to provide full line security and monitoring of the environment. So as we look at kind of taking that to the next level of what identity access management, especially in encrypted networks, is able to monitor today, a lot of 20% of the identities are currently really above the waterline here. So that's just the tip of the iceberg if you think of all of the human-centric or interactive users that are out there, particularly using SSH, logging into a jump host or logging in directly to a server. There's some monitoring capabilities with human interactions, such as email monitoring, password vaults, jump host, security intelligence solutions. I used to work at a security intelligence vendor, so I'm quite aware of the ability to pull logs and correlation and look at anomalies. But the one thing that's really missing from that whole apparatus is what's below the waterline, what's below the tip of the iceberg, where 80% of SSH identities actually live and work. And those are oftentimes machine-to-machine identities, so they're not actually a human so much as they are a machine that's given access to another machine to do transactional business. In that area, most organizations lack sufficient access controls, continuous monitoring, DLP, or forensics capabilities in the machine-to-machine networks. And there is little to no centralized identity management and access monitoring. So really, it's a big problem that the market, with what we're introducing, is now able to address. It's definitely something that's caught on, especially with the early adopters, and now we're moving and seeing a larger growth into other industries beyond financial sectors and the other high-risk folks. We're now seeing this becoming a very hot-button issue, especially with recent events that have occurred inside the federal government, to be able to control these identities, both the interactive human folks that are actually working in the organization, but also the machine-to-machine transactions. If we look at, does this really happen? Have there been insider attacks exploiting the encrypted networks? And I don't want to get into the politics of whether this was a good thing or a bad thing, but I do want to bring up the fact that I don't think in any enterprise environment we want to have people inside our organization infiltrating our networks and taking information out and using it as they wish. So if we look at the Edward Snowden case, which I'm sure everyone's aware of, that attack vector is still unknown. However, recent high-level statements show that keys were probably used to execute the attack. So in this case, a recent statement was made by U.S. National Security Agency Director Keith Alexander, who told the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence that Snowden was able to gain access to NSA files that he should not have had access to by fabricating digital keys. We're still waiting to hear what that exactly means. We don't know what type of keys, it was SSH keys, but there's a similar methodology as far as usage and storage and issues as far as management that apply across the board. Today we'll talk specifically about SSH keys because that's what we're experts in. And to give you also another example of insider attacks that have exploited the SSH environment or poorly managed SSH environment, there was a former HostGator employee who used a SSH key to gain unfettered access to 2,700 servers. And that potentially put thousands of their customers' websites at risk. In fact, he used his broad access to put an SSH key in each one of the servers, giving him a backdoor into the environment even after he was terminated. So let's take a look first at how a lack of identity access management controls and encrypted networks enables successful insider attacks. So this is kind of a current state analysis. If you look at SSH access controls, here's probably something you could say and ask yourself these questions as I go through these bullet points. Are you able to account for users? Most organizations actually say no, we're not. Most organizations don't know who has access to what information. And there's no centralized control over key creation. They're unable to identify trust relationships, and there's a lack of key removal and rotation. Again, they can't standardize on key size and type. So this leaves within SSH access controls a gaping hole in comparison to identity access management controls in other parts of your network. So really it's sort of the wild, wild west if you don't have a key management and monitoring solution in place, because without centralized control over key creation, anyone can start dropping keys onto the servers and gaining access to this. This, of course, has proliferated over time, and this creates a bigger and bigger problem over time. From a business continuity standpoint, the inability to identify the trust relationships, the one-to-one relationships, or the one-to-many relationships that often take place inside the environment creates a business continuity risk issue. And folks are very unlikely to, organizations are very unlikely to, one, have the capacity to do it, nor want to remove keys because they don't know what they do and what they're mapped to. So this is a huge, huge problem. And of course, standardizing on key size and type and other configurations within the environment is really impossible. It's impossible to enforce policy without a centralized controlling mechanism doing this. So from an access control standpoint, there's definitely weaknesses, but now those, of course, can be addressed by what we're providing. But I just want to give you sort of a current state analysis of this. When we start looking at this from a zero trust standpoint and insider activity, we know that malicious insiders pose a significant threat. They're authorized to operate behind the perimeter, and it's very difficult to control in a BYOD cloud and extended enterprise environment. This is especially important when contractors are involved. I think that was the case with Snowden. That's actually the case broadly with the government. And in fact, for a lot of IT organizations, there's a lot of contractors out there as well. I think Joe here, he's got a whole group of contractors that he works with on projects that work on a project-by-project basis. And that can be a more difficult thing to manage because you're managing people who are inside the environment but aren't necessarily direct employees. And so ubiquitous encryption is something that's part of the zero trust model. So zero trust sort of brings about the concept that the perimeter is not secure, that people are going to penetrate the perimeter either through advanced persistent threats or other means. Ubiquitous encryption as a component of zero trust is really, though, a double-edged sword. So you're not trusting any part of your network to pass information in the clear, and you want to prevent man-in-the-middle attacks even when it's internal and safe parts of your environment or highly secure parts of your environment. But what that also does, it creates a blind spot for your forensics and security ops teams to what malicious insiders are doing. So if someone decides to engage in malicious activity and they happen to either gain access to or have access to your servers through an SSH key or any encrypted method, they're really going to be able to gain access. And in most companies right now, that access could be fairly wide because the access controls aren't there, but also they're going to be able to do so in an unmonitored way. And the final of my 3 slides in this section, a lack of security intelligence in encrypted channels. So security ops and forensics teams, as I said, are blinded by encryption. And this is because they're unable to monitor and inspect content transmitted across encrypted networks. And that poses a real problem because if we talk about security intelligence, if we look at the big SIEM vendors that have been red hot in this decade and the last decade as far as providing correlation rules to be able to look for anomalous activity inside the environment, you cannot find that inside of the encrypted networks without having a specially designed sniffer type working in there, or a friendly man in the middle as we call it, designed to actually inspect this traffic and see what's crossing across the networks. And that means you're going to be able to unable to prevent data loss on these encrypted networks. In addition, you won't have the ability to know which user was compromised or which user engaged in malicious activities. And you're also going to be blind to where the information was taken from or to. So that's a real big problem. In fact, if you look at the Snowden case, and I'll bring this one up again because it's such a hot topic issue, recently I saw a news report where they said, we know that the amount of information that was taken was massive and devastating, but we really don't know what was taken at this point. Only what's being released through news outlets do we know what's been taken. So if that happens in a enterprise environment, let's say a bank, credit card processor, pharmaceutical company with their IP at risk, manufacturing organizations, again, with their IP at risk, obviously this can create a huge issue that would be similar in scope, at least to that organization, as what the recent breach inside the NSA created. In addition to that, currently right now, encrypted networks really are not integrated into these security intelligence architecture. So we talked a little bit about SIEM and real-time content-aware capabilities, correlation, and looking for anomalous activity. Once it exits the endpoint, it's really invisible to what's going on in the network and the encrypted network. So it's really important that we start to look at this from the standpoint as we need to treat the encrypted networks both from an access control, but also from a monitoring DLP and to be able to review any activity post-exploit, to be able to treat those the same way that we treat our other networks inside the organization. So threat vectors, and this is where I can use Joe a little bit why we invited him today, because we can talk a little bit about what Joe's experiences out there in the real world where he's looking at threat vectors. And I know this is why most folks have come here to kind of see what we found in our consultative services that we provide with some of the Fortune F500 companies out there. And realistically, all of these are going to show the same basic concept of how the threat vector would occur, and this probably is somewhat obvious to most folks here. But just to reiterate that, here's your malicious insider. They have access to servers with authorized keys. If you don't have proper access control, they could have unfettered access to a broad range of servers they shouldn't have access to. Depending on how poor your access controls are in your SSH environment, they're probably going to be able to take, if they decide to act in a malicious fashion, all that information out, extract it from your enterprise, and take it out to wherever they want to take it to, And they're all going to do that so that you're not going to know who exactly did it. So you're not going to know who was compromised, what identity was compromised, or who did what. So as I show you these other attack vectors, a similar, you'll get a similar view of the same methodology, the same problems. First, let's look at keys. So there's some confusion sometimes about keys and certificates and the difference. Keys are basically the keys to the castle. So they are stored in a simple text file located in a directory on the client and server machine. An asymmetric public key, key pair, public and private key pair grants access and establishes the secure connection. So the private identity key plus the public authorized key, that's going to grant access and establish the secure connection into the environment. It's a simple text file. So I think what most folks think of as keys being something highly complex. How they're generated is actually quite complex, but because they're stored as a text file, if they're accessible, they can be copied and pasted, they can be written down. There's all kinds of ways that people can get a hold of these private keys, and if they have access to a server and place the public key on that, then they have access to the server as well. So what SSH keys do, they grant access to systems when the key pairs match, as I said. The keys are tied to a user, but without proper management controls, the actual user can be nearly impossible to determine. So it's very easy for someone who has maybe stolen or acquired or let someone borrow their key to impersonate that user. And based upon configuration, key usage can be configured to control what commands can be used and establish a whitelist of machines that can use a particular key. So that's very important because within the configuration, and if you can get the configurations set globally in your organization to policy, you can prevent people from executing certain commands which could be considered high risk. And at the same time, you can ensure that keys can only be utilized from certain machines to other machines in the environment. So that's two very important things that need to be considered when you think of the extended capabilities of your SSH keys along with your configurations in the environment. So attack vector number one here, we're going to look at exploiting development keys in production environments. Insiders can easily gain or exploit poor key management controls to gain access to production HA and backup servers. And I think this is one of the more common ones that we see where people think they don't have this existing in their environment, but they do. What most organizations, when we first come in and talk to them, whether we're doing an initial discovery or we're deploying our risk assessment tool with them, which I'll talk about a little bit later, they think they have production servers that are basically only business users are being able to access, and that there's no direct route from development to production, that developers just have access to the testing environment. But as we go in and do discovery, and especially with the proliferation of keys and the lack of control over the servers and the environment, and this has gone on now for 10 years or more, what we tend to find is something that looks like this, where occasionally we have business users who can access testing environments, but more common than that, we see developers who've taken keys from testing environments and somehow those have been pushed through to production servers. And now development has direct access into the production server. So Joe, I know in one of the cases that you've been working on, this has been one of the major audit findings, or in fact how they found an audit finding, I think, via the Monetary Authority of Singapore. So in your view, how prevalent is this and how significant is it?
So we've actually seen this in quite a few cases, and the one that you're mentioning in particular, it was not an actual interactive user and developer going into production, but it was a development process that was accidentally being putting development data into a production environment. And as I'm sure many of you would know, that if you start corrupting the production environment data, there can be catastrophic consequences to that, whether, especially if you're a bank or a credit card processor or things like that, like you mentioned before. So it really can affect it. And of course, you do have developers that might be putting code directly in production without any regulations in place, and that causes an outage because they didn't test something properly, going directly from development to production can, as everyone I'm sure on the call can attest to, that can cause a huge amount of risk to the company.
From the standpoint of a malicious insider, if that developer wants to go into production servers, is that a high-risk issue that you would see flagged by security teams?
Well, yeah, of course, because in most corporations and companies that there's a clear division that developers should not be able to get into production. If a developer does get in production and is a malicious insider, it certainly can give them access to data and data that they can take out of the environment that would be very hard to track back to that particular developer if there's not some kind of controls in place to track and prevent that kind of thing.
So that definitely can be a high-risk issue. So a lot of the customers and folks we've been dealing with initially have been in the financial sector. What type of information is on the production server that could lead to either a compliance or a real threat? Is it credit card information, customer information, business information, all of the above? Is that really the concern that they have from a security standpoint?
Yeah, I mean it's all of the above essentially. I mean there's as I mentioned before, there's a huge amount of risk to allowing development machines or developers themselves direct access to production in any environment.
Yeah, and I think as we've spread out in the space over the past 2 years working on these projects, so we've seen these in almost every organization that we've gone into at varying levels of severity, but without the ability to actually detect the keys where they're at, I think in the mapping, I think that sort of has shocked a lot of people as they've done the initial discovery and mappings to find out the scale and scope. Have you been involved with the initial scope, and how far off are people from where they think they are compared to how they really are in this particular attack vector?
Well, I mean, people know, the companies know that they don't really know what's going on. So but whenever we provide them a report or the mapping, as you mentioned, of what their keys have access to, it's pretty overwhelming for some customers because they do have huge environments, millions of keys, and being out and seeing that there's systems that are or users that shouldn't have access to production environments and the risk that can entail has been a huge eye-opener for a lot of companies.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. We've definitely heard the same thing on the marketing end. So let's jump to attack vector number 2, and this is actually, we've seen this as well, and most folks think they have this problem with interactive users solved. And the reality is with this, if they're using a jump host, here's a common problem. The first login, the user logs into the server via jump host, and then now they're in the servers, but all of a sudden the user decides he's going to upload a public key into the environment to either one or multiple servers or a whole host of servers. At that point, subsequent logins, the user can bypass the jump host and internal security controls using the SSH key. So the first question there is, what value does a jump host provide beyond direct access?
Well, I mean, jump hosts can be useful, and we see a lot of our customers utilizing them, but because it can allow someone, at least in the initial phase, to go directly into one central location. The problem that, as you mentioned, that can happen is that once they have access to those back-end servers, if there aren't other security methods put in place to prevent a direct connection, they can simply put like you said, an authorized key onto those servers and bypass that. Most companies will utilize a jump host for tracking purposes. They want to be able to see when users are connecting, and even audit those or restrict the actual access during business hours or things of that sort. And that's one of the advantages of a jump host. But if you don't manage the environment after the fact, and you aren't tracking whether there's new keys being added into those destination systems, then you can open up that back door, as you might put it, into those systems directly from a individual user's laptop.
So there, the individual user definitely is able to operate outside of the normal practices. In addition to this, of course, the machine traffic, machines don't log in through a jump host, correct?
That's correct.
So that area is that 80% of the SSH identities and basically the traffic as well that is operating below the waterline or below the tip of the iceberg isn't going to be addressed by a jump host as well. So it's only a partial solution, and there's potentially a lot of risk if you don't have it set up 100% properly and to really manage this. So really,
yeah, and you can even risk. This is a risk to the 80% as well, because once you get access to to the system, it could be that someone is setting up a non-interactive authentication using those using those keys. So it could be that someone goes through the jump host and sets up an authentication to pull data onto, for instance, their development machine, if we go back to the discussion we had before.
Yep, I think along a similar attack vector here, attack vector number 3 that we can discuss briefly is circumventing mainframe security. So I know that mainframe is utilized, been utilized forever because it's considered the security workhorse. It's very, very, very strong, but in this case, a user can log in through RACF to the mainframe, and the user can do the same thing, upload the public key. And of course, at that time, from here on, the user can bypass RACF authentication via an SSH key and copy the credentials throughout mainframe Unix file system. And of course, at that point, it can also give copies of that key out to different users and processes, which can then access the mainframe. So we're seeing kind of a similar thing, but here again, we've got customers who are asking us about this because they know the backdoor that exists. Any thoughts on this as far as its implications towards mainframe security? Is this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's similar in the aspect that RACF is used, as you mentioned, as the central point for a lot of ZOS environments for authentication and tracking of those users coming into the environment. And it's it's like a backdoor essentially to those mainframe systems, which, as you know, holds very valid or very secure data within many environments. So
yeah, so definitely when people are expecting to have security in a certain way things operate and not realizing that there's this hidden backdoor, that's really a shocking thing for folks because they think they have it covered, but then they realize that they don't.
Yeah, we actually have one customer that is setting up key environment, but they won't set it up without that administration in place because of this exact reason.
Yep, definitely. So let's look at attack vector number 4. Now this is one that is, and I do it last because this is one that, as our founder and CEO explained to me, he's also the inventor of the SSH protocol, that within encrypted networks, it doesn't really matter what it is, but if you've got sloppy key management, in this case, or sloppy access controls, that one user with access to one server in machine-to-machine environment can potentially, with a lost or stolen key, get access to one server and then use transitive trust to access one server to another. This is very common in machine-to-machine environment. Or if someone were to gain access to a very high level of privilege, a key that granted a high level of privilege, or a root key. When you're looking at some of the cases that you've been at, and we're actually going to go through a real-world case study in a second, how prevalent is it that you see root keys or high-level keys being randomly placed in the environment or no one knowing that they're there?
Yeah, so I mean, what I've seen in a lot of environments, like it shows on this slide, is that there are root key setups or authorizations set up into a particular server, but what's not thought of beyond that server is what that access can actually give them to other servers within the environment. Because logging in as a root user into a machine can give you access to any of the private keys that are within that environment. Right? If you're not monitoring those connections and making sure that those connections and those keys are set up in a way that's preventing, they could essentially take those private keys again off of that system and go onto another environment, or do as you show here, jumping from system to system, and in some cases gaining elevated privileges on a machine that they shouldn't have access to simply because they had elevated privileges on a machine prior to that.
Right. So this can be something where basically they can go across the network pretty quickly and do a significant amount of damage. And I think that some of what these attack vectors, how they're enabled, is because when these keys have been deployed in the past, it could be 10 years ago, correct?
I've seen in some environments that's probably 15 years. I've seen the timestamp on a key being 10, 15 years old.
So there's no rotation, there's no removal.
Right.
You find this all over the place. And there's no way to detect it because the key files aren't being discovered. No simple text file, there's no tool in place to discover it. So so that's really not possible for them to even find the key. So they're, in some organizations, including, I think, some very high targets, very valuable targets. I think some of the numbers are 10 to 15% of the keys in their environment were high privileged, and no one knew that they were actually in existence.
Yeah,
and some belong to employees that are no longer there.
Many of them are employees
that are no longer
there.
Yes. So it's a huge challenge, and I think once people start to implement discovery on this and learning the scope of it, as you learned in real life deployments, they'll really want to address this issue. So just to kind of summarize the attack vectors here that we've talked about, each attack vector discussed exploits sloppy key management. In our experience, almost every enterprise we have consulted with has an access control problem where one or more of these attack vectors is a major risk factor. And most organizations do not have the ability to capture security intelligence or forensics data if an exploit were to occur in the encrypted network. So that's really the encrypted channel monitoring piece that folks are missing. Access control is key, and controlling the keys is very important. But you also need to make sure you have that extra backstop to make sure that you're monitoring the environment just like you're monitoring the other environments. So before we begin the next session here with the real-world case study, I want to point everybody here to IDC's report on SSH Access Controls. It's a third-party validation of the existence of the issue. And I'm sure you're starting to see more and more of this out there. If you search for SSH keys on Google, you'll find tons of articles out there on this as this has become now the next stage, and it's the stage beyond username and passwords. That's what IAM has been, is very username and password centric. So now we're solving for keys the same issues that have been in existence for those other methods of authentication for quite some time. So real-world case study here, and we've talked a little bit about this and talked around it a little bit, but let's look at it more directly. So we have a top 5 global bank, over 10,000 hosts, and 20,000 plus SSH user accounts in the environment. So going in there and doing discovery, 1.5 million keys were found in the environment, and 10% or 150,000 keys were unknown and had a high level of privilege. So this pretty much, we've gone through many organizations and have found similar numbers and similar ratios. But when you're managing 2.5 trillion in assets on your books and you've got 10% or 150,000 keys that potentially grant access to a large swath of the environment, that's got to be a frightening thing for the customer, I would think.
Yeah, and not to mention that, I mean, you see the number of keys there. It's also not just the number of keys, it's the number of keys that are growing, because if you're not taking care of this, that 1.5 million could very easily, in a large environment like this, double in 10 years. It's really about kind of stopping the bleeding, stopping getting process around it, managing the keys in a way that allows you to look at those keys, see which ones are valid, and start chipping away at them and using the tools that are available in order to clean up those keys and make it to where you have the confidence in your authentication and within your environment.
And from a deployment and sort of a consultative approach that I think we take, it's really the software and the tool is one piece in that, but there's a lot of other services that you provide in the process to get these organizations sort of right back on track, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later. But it is more than just the software tool itself. It's actually changing the way that the organization deals with providing access and removing access to encrypted environments.
Right, exactly. I like to think of it as a process. I mean, you first, need to obviously identify the problem. You then, once you've identified the problem, you need to, see how you realize the problem. You see how bad the problem is. Stop the bleeding, like I mentioned. So, going forward, you're not always hitting a moving target. So once you've kind of locked it down, you start the processes in place, and you've done the monitoring that the tools provide, you can then start to see which keys are being used, which keys can be removed, which ones you should lock down a bit more, how long keys have been out there. Should you be rotating your keys? In most environments, I very rarely see an environment where a key gets rotated. So existing root level SA might leave the company and take that private key with them, and you never know if he's going to try to come in 10 years down the road and access these systems.
Right, that's sort of the zero trust model. So someone can break through the perimeter and use a key that they had from 10 years ago. That could be a real challenge, especially if they have some financial gain that could happen such as stealing credit card information.
Right. So then once you've cleaned up the keys, it's really about creating an ongoing process that that makes sure that those keys don't get out of control again.
Right. So we'll continue here with the real-world example, and we'll talk about business continuity risk, security risk, compliance risk. And part of the reason why organizations just don't go out and do this on their own is because of the complexity and you need of taking control of those problems. So you may want to have done it before you try to do it the first time, right, Joe? So for organizations, they don't try to address this on their own from a business continuity standpoint because oftentimes they don't know what their keys do, right? So I think in your experience, you probably have found situations where there's been keys that you discover, and all of a sudden you have to go figure out what they're mapped to and how that would impact them if they were just to go in there and remove that, right?
Yeah, we've been in situations where the owner of a key has told us that, or told some of my contractors that it's safe to remove this key, and then obviously through the testing they've identified before we actually remove the key that that key is in fact actually used, and that's one of the key parts of what we can do is actually go in and monitor the usage of those keys, so that we don't remove a key that's important.
Use. And then of course once you've taken control of this with the software tool, then that's going to be automated going forward.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So once you've identified this, you really cut down that risk to business continuity that you're going to actually shut down a major process such as moving over a massive amount of batch file transfers at a critical time for critical business process, right? So security risks in addition to that, so obviously we've talked about this already a little bit, but they didn't have controls in place to prevent the individual system administrator from adding permanent credentials, as we talked about in vector number 2. That's a pretty significant issue. And they couldn't prevent privileged user accounts from creating backdoors without unauthorized keys. And realistically, they didn't really have good policy controls, so they couldn't restrict what commands could be executed by a user or a machine. So it was kind of you were lucky to get some type of sameness of policy enforcement, and really enforcement wasn't really possible. From an audit standpoint, as we get into the compliance section here, was it even possible for them to tell an auditor what was going on in their environment, or was it just sort of a known risk that they just didn't know how to even report on?
Yeah, it was, I mean, for this particular customer, it was an open audit item for quite some time, and they were not able to tell them what was going on in their environment. They didn't have the mapping of keys. They didn't have the monitoring in place of what those keys are being used for. So really it was we know we have this risk, and it eventually got to the point where they had to do something about it.
And of course, they probably had that failed audit item on their list for a couple years. So
I believe it was around 5 years.
5 years. So if they had caught this early on, they probably would have had a lot less key proliferation in their environment.
Yes.
Significantly less. So catching one of these things early is kind of like catching some kind of illness, right? You've got to catch this early on, and it's a lot easier to treat. So of course, the compliance risk here, failed monetary authority of Singapore audit. Why does that apply to most of the folks on here in the Americas? One, it's because that compliance requirement you may come under if you're a global organization, but also it very closely mirrors SOX. So if an organization fails on monetary authority of Singapore audit, in all likelihood, they're going to have problems with SOX. For that matter, if we look at potential audit findings for current and emerging compliance standards and updates, we have different levels of specificity in each one of these, and there's other compliance requirements. I won't list them all because there's so many. These are some of the major ones. Monetary Authority of Singapore provides the most specificity. We're actually working with NIST. Something should be out there pretty soon, talking specifically about SSH keys, authentication methods, other authentication methods. PCI's got version 3 out. We're excited to see what's in that. We've been working with them for a couple years now. SOX already has a general requirement of controlling access in Section 5.8. Of course, NERC and HIPAA also have this requirement as well. So each of these could be a potential audit finding in addition to all the security issues that are going on in your environment right now. So the compliance piece is there. What I think auditors, and I know I'm working with auditors, and we'll see more on this in the coming month with an exciting announcement due out later this month, is language within these compliance mandates that's more specific to actual testing for these types of problems in the environment versus general and generic things. And the second piece of that is also educating the auditors and internal compliance folks of how to audit for and test for these types of problems. So I think that we'll start to see these sort of complete the, if you look, reminded of the boxes I showed you at the beginning, the red box, the red quadrant, we're now starting to see compliance and also tools and services move towards helping us solve the problems with both interactive users in the encrypted environment, but also machine-to-machine users in the environment. And if you go to our in the news section, just to give you an idea of some of the coverage that I think just we've received, and we're not, there's other folks with other authentication methods that are covered out there in the press world, but if you go to the in the news section of our website at ssh.com, you can read more about sort of the thought leadership out there around keys and key management and security issues around that. It's good just to take a view of this and see what the peers out there in the space are talking about. Now, let's go through solutions here. And Joe talked a little bit about the processes and approach, and we can just go through this briefly to show you how SSH's information assurance platform can help prevent or mitigate the impacts of a malicious insider. And then if we have time towards the end, we'll actually take some questions. You guys can ask Joe or myself questions. I'm sure Joe will be more popular on that front. But let's begin here. So about 2 years ago, we started building a centralized SSH management platform. So you all know SSH Communication Security. You definitely know the protocol which we invented. It's one of the most widely used protocols in the world. Our centralized SSH management platform, which we call the Information Assurance Platform, works on Unix, Windows, Linux, and IBM environments. And essentially what we do is we provide an easily integrated, interoperable, minimally invasive, you could say, platform that does configuration and host key management, deployment management, user key management, access controls, auditing, automation, and authentication. What we've touched on mostly today is user key management, access control, auditing, and a little bit with authentication as well. We do provide a full host of management tools as well, in addition to our commercially supported client-server products that's used by a huge number of the Fortune 500 because it's really the trusted solution, and it's really bringing together some of the really features and support that you need in order to operate in a true enterprise environment. Our mainframe tools as well are in a class of its own, helping folks with legacy file transfer issues and other challenges. In addition, it's the only, I believe, the only mainframe. Our solution allows the key management tool to automatically work on the mainframe as well. So you would gain the security benefits of our key management tool and our overall platform with that. We work with our own commercial SSH client-server products as well as OpenSSH, and we can also interoperate with other SSH client and server products as well. So as Joe was talking about a little bit, we wanted to discuss how we solve the problem. So solving the problem first comes with the problem scope. This is with our SRA tool. Discovery, lockdown, remediation, management, and continuous monitoring once you're in a fully managed state so that you can retain all that hard work that you've done. You don't want to go back into an unmanaged state. This is actually really important because a lot of folks think they can handle this on a project basis, right? Joe said, like, someone will come and say, we can just handle this internally on a project basis, but then you're right back to where you started before without continuous monitoring.
Right, exactly. And sure, I mean, you can do some things on a project-by-project basis, but until you kind of develop the whole environment into this process, then you're going to find that these issues will reappear.
So our SSH Risk Assessor, our SRA, is available online at ssh.com/SRA. And with this tool, you're basically going to be able to run a script out there that's going to pull a report across whatever servers you have access to, and you can take a snapshot of your environment, and you can learn about the trust relationships in your environment, your key age, key strengths, private keys older than 2 years, SSH servers with known vulnerabilities, SSH client and server version, number of duplicate private keys not password protected, number of root authorizations, and total number of host keys, private and public user keys. So you're going to be able to get a really good snapshot with this. I don't know if you've been involved in the deployments of any of these. I know that I've been involved in a couple, as are a couple other people on the team. It shows you a pretty concise report, especially for executive level folks, to say, hey, here's the size of our report. I think I was working with really it's a Fortune 100 company, and they had done a small snapshot of about 50 hosts in their environment and came back and said they knew there was a problem, but it was much worse than they thought. Is this kind of like what you're seeing as well when you're out there with this?
Yeah, I mean, I like you said, it's been mostly some of my professional services guys that have run these things, but I have seen the report, and the particular one you're discussing, exactly what you're saying. They were quite amazed by the results of these, just because they didn't know that their key situation was as bad as it was.
So really they were able to determine problem scope. And if you fill out that form, someone will send you this. We actually will have one of our solutions folks send this to you. It's pretty easy to run. Any admin can run it. So it's a free tool, so you might as well utilize this to figure out where the issues are. In a small environment, you could actually use the tool to do some configurations here and there and update it. In a broader environment, you really, once you get over 100 servers, you really need to have a real solution in place. So one of the big things, and this is one of the first things we do when we go into a identity access management discussion within an organization, is we need to do discovery. We need to discover all existing trust relationships and who can access what. Of course, this discovers a requirement of the keys that are authorized for login, the authorized keys, and all private keys, the identity keys. And this must be done with all users on all servers, and preferably also on desktops. The next step in that is lockdown. So here is where you're really going to enforce all your approvals through a centralized process. For all key setups and other key operations, you're going to relocate all authorized key to root-owned directory that is under the control of the key manager. So at this point, you're locking down the environment so that only the key manager is going to be able to deploy keys. And this is sort of that stopping the bleeding kind of thing that you talked about.
Yeah, exactly. It's essentially, you said it, it's the stopping the bleeding section of the process. You're making it so that everyday users can't set up these authorizations without any kind of change request or things like that going on.
Right. So that's a great spot to be at when you're able to control your environment for the first time.
All right.
Remediation. So determine which keys are actually used and where the keys are used from. These somewhat happen in tandem a little bit, remediation in the lockdown period. And then you're able to remove the orphan keys and keys that are no longer in use, especially if you've got root keys that are kind of just laying around. Those things are good to find and delete or
right,
pull out
exactly.
service.
And one of the things that our product will do is it will allow you to monitor the usage of those keys so that you can exactly determine this key is not being used, or this connection came in from a development machine or something. We need to remove that key.
Yep.
Kind of thing.
So then management. So now we're going to get into some of the business uses for this, including reducing the cost to deploy keys and so forth. But essentially, we're going to eliminate a lot of the manual work that currently goes on in key deployment processes. So also from the security side, that'll eliminate human errors and save costs with automated key creation and removals. And obviously, you're going to reduce the number of administrators who have access control privileges to the point at which they can deploy these keys. So that's going to reduce that circle of people who are insiders to just those people who are operating the key manager, correct?
That's right. And I just want to add something here, is that we do offer an API which allows you to connect our management tools into your existing infrastructure so that you don't have to use a new tool. You don't have to learn a new tool. We can help you implement that into just existing change management request or something of that sort.
And of course, rotating and controlling, so we can rotate those keys and based upon time limits. So that's really not something that's feasible at all without a tool, because it would take at 15,000 hosts like a couple years to rotate all those keys. So that would be really not feasible. And of course, also as we talked about, we now have full control where the key can be used from, and the commands that can be executed through simplified policy enforcement and configuration management, correct?
Correct. Yep.
So that's really going to eliminate a lot of the risks that you have. Even if an insider does have access to an environment, now you're segmenting that environment off based on what they should have access to. You're removing their access. You know where your root keys are, so they're not floating around out there. And really, it's a very well segmented environment, and you're able to reduce the amount of commands that someone can utilize in the environment. So, and from that point, we look at continuous monitoring as well. So continuous monitoring in the environment, we can detect unauthorized key operations occurring outside the key manager, i.e. key set up by a root user. We can generate alerts, enforce SSH software versions and configurations, and prevent users from installing SSH server software. In addition to this as well, we provide a solution that allows you to monitor the encrypted channel so you can continuously monitor all your SSH, SFTP, and RDP traffic. So this is that case where, for instance, the NSA breach case, where if that person did have access to a system, and I actually have a graphic for this in a moment, we would actually be able to shut down the connection depending on type of correlation rules or data loss prevention rules that we had in place because we're monitoring these networks. At the very least, you'd have forensics capabilities. So this is really what an encrypted channel monitoring environment kind of looks like. We kind of summarizes it best. You've got cloud, remote administrators, and BYOD. Here in the middle here, you've got DLP enforcement and audit trail. So essentially, connections that shouldn't be happening or information that's going across the channel that shouldn't be happening can get shut down by the crypto auditor. That's something we call the hound. This also enables four eyes administration, so that means you've got one person can request access, and that access can then be approved or denied manually by the human on the other end. And you've also got the capabilities now for SIM integration into your encrypted networks for monitoring purposes and pulling those great and powerful correlation rules and continuous monitoring type reports together and real-time alerts. And you've also got the DLP integration, which we've just implemented with an ICAP integration. Of course, all that information is going to be stored in your crypto auditor vault. So in this case, if someone were to go in the environment and we're actually able to steal some information or engage in some kind of malicious activity, you could actually monitor them. And I don't have an example of it here today, but we can actually do a demo of this with anyone who's interested later. We can actually show you a video replay of exactly what the person did, as well. It's highly searchable and easily indexed, so we can definitely find the point of exploit. And that's really going to provide that extra level of security and monitoring in the environment. So you've got the access controls, and now you've got the ability to provide data loss prevention, forensics, and also integration into your security intelligence architecture. To give you an idea of this and what it does, looking at it from an external attacker, I know that we're talking about insiders today, but putting this full solution line in place, you're going to be able to, with access controls and key management, stop someone from getting into the system. Even if they were able to get into the system as an external hacker, the crypto auditor is going to be able to block them, and that's going to stop that particular threat vector. From a malicious insider, I know there were 4 examples we gave today, but in some instances, that person or malicious insider is going to still have access controls. With crypto auditor, we're actually going to be able to monitor that traffic and probably shut it down if they're pulling something out, such as credit card information. So this would be helpful in an instance where basically all traffic that's SSH, SFTP, and RDP is going to go through the crypto auditor. Even if you did have a situation where someone in development somehow got access to a production server and they're pulling out credit card information, you're connecting this to your DLP and you're enabling your DLP to now act in the encrypted channel, Joe. Would this then help prevent that type of data loss?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, essentially we do real-time DLP. We have a real-time DLP integration. So as the connection is going through, we can kill the connection based on DLP rules or update the actual data that's being transferred to have dummy data in place so that it doesn't actually transfer those credit card information across.
And for your authorized administrators, they're obviously still going to be able to access the systems they need to access. They're going to be properly segmented. So folks operating the way that they should be operating aren't going to have an issue. And crypto auditor, because it's an inline solution, there actually isn't going to be any interruption to their work processes. And it also can monitor the machine-to-machine traffic, which a jump host can't do, correct? That's correct. So really, you're going to take control of now not just maybe 20% or a fraction of your identities in your SSH environment or a fraction of the traffic, but now it's full control of the entire network. So success-proof needs, and I'll leave you with this slide, and we'll go to questions real quick. So we've got a top 5 global bank, as we talked about, selected Universal SSH Key Manager as well as our remediation services to help resolve their issues across their environment. And one of the U.S.'s largest rail transportation logistic companies is in the process of deploying UCAM as well. The Washington Post, one of the nation's largest media companies, has a fully deployed UCAM in their environment. Their need was really cumbersome and costly provisioning issues, and security was the nice to have there, but they're able to resolve both issues at the same time with our solution. And then a major European securities depository has selected Crypto Auditor to monitor and control external application developers and administrators working in their data centers, and I believe these data centers are located in Europe while the developers are located offshore. So this is giving a lot of capability to allow the business to continue to operate without having some type of a risk of, especially since they're in a foreign country, someone being able to pull that information out and potentially steal money or securities from this major European depository. So now we've got a few moments here. I know we promised 45 minutes and we're right there. If anyone has any questions here, we'll take a few up to about 2 or about 3 o'clock. Let's see, here's one. How do you force traffic to pass through the crypto auditor helm? The diagram looks very much like a jump host scenario. Can it be bypassed in a similar way?
So I'll go ahead and answer that one, Jason. So the crypto auditor hound, in most cases, you would situate your network in a way that would pass only the traffic that you need into only the traffic that you're wanting to monitor into that environment. For instance, your SSH or RDP traffic would be redirected into the crypto auditor itself, and from that manner, the network itself would be the one that would direct that traffic, so that you weren't utilizing extra processing for protocols and whatnot that you don't want to monitor.
Excellent. And one question, of course, we always get, we'll use some of the slides. Yes, we will have one of our sales development folks or solutions support folks who will be contacting you guys. They will send you the slide deck out. And at this time, I don't see any other questions. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to submit them very quickly. If I don't see anything in a couple of seconds, we'll go ahead and end the webinar. Of course, you can always email us directly, or you can contact us through the contact us forms on the website. My email address is jason.thompson@ssh.com, and Joe's is joe.scack@ssh.com. We'll be more than happy to talk with you or get you the right person to talk to based upon any questions that you have. And I don't see any other questions coming through right now, but I see some. We had a great attendance for this, so I want to thank everybody for taking time out during their day-to-day to talk about this issue, and hopefully this helps shed some light on some very important issues that really have been living below the covers, or beneath the water, as we say here. All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.